again, everyone. We'll get started theory-wise, theory speaking. I'm going to try to make everything you learned today in theory as easy as possible. My theory does not have to be hard, it can be fun. So I've got quizzes returned to you from last class, and again, overall those were very good. So I was encouraged and pleased to see that. So today what you have is you have workbook page 168. And I was going to play this for you. So if you give me, if you'll give me 1 minute, I'll see if I can get this up and through the big speakers. All I got to do is connect, I think. All right, let's see. I have written down that it's 18.2 A7. Let's start over. I think that's the one. How would you like to be like at a school where they make CDs for these things, and the students are actually part of they're on the recordings for these CDs? How would you like to be? Some people are like, maybe not. All right, from the beginning, let's try this.
Exercise 18.2 A7.
So it's not a very many measures, but Mozart hits 3 different keys in this short example. Goes through 3 different keys. So I would like to see who has questions about what in particular on this piece. We had said that last class that it starts in A flat, it goes to another key in the middle, and it ends in G minor. That should be the final key. And I think I even mentioned somewhere in here that you should have a passing 6/4. Did you find a P6/4? Not sure. Okay. Maybe you just thought you found it in passing. you weren't sure about it, but no. Okay, so yeah. Does anyone have any questions about a particular chord? And did I tell you to move the pivot chord to the measure 45? Yes?
Could you talk about measure 43 and measure 3?
Okay. The third measure of the example, which is measure 43, I have 2 chords in that bar. The first half of that measure, which looks like it's, by the way, this is just, it must be in like 2/4. It doesn't give us a time signature, but that looks like it's the meter. So the first beat, or the first half of that measure, we have an A flat major chord, but it's in second inversion. And then the second half of that bar, we have in the bass especially, you can see E flat, G, B flat, and D flat in no particular order. So that looks like it's a 5/7. So what kind of 6/4 chord comes before a 5/7 typically? A 1/6/4, right? Cadential. 1/6/4, that's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the 5/7 is in root position? Yeah. Because we got the here comes a cadence, basically. I mean, that's not the text that Mozart wrote, of course, but and that's a cadence in A flat. So the first system, I hope, it's kind of, well, yeah, kind of partitioned, but I mean, the whole first system is in A flat. And that's why I wanted you to move the pivot chord down to measure 45, because I think it makes a little more sense there. Measure 45 starts another phrase. Another phrase. I think, just so you know, I have one secondary chord in my analysis. Did you find a secondary chord? Good. And I think the pivot, did they give you a pivot chord in measure 49? Yeah, I think that's a good place for that one. I believe that I am not going to be grading any of the non-chord tones. I think I'm just going to be grading your analysis, your Roman numerals, and your keys, and your pivot chord, and things like that. At least I'm looking at my answer key right here, and I don't see any points assigned to non-chord tones. Okay, other things that I maybe can help you with before I collect this.
Can we go to measure
47. Let me write down the notes. In the base of the accompaniment, in the left hand, we have F sharp. In the right hand of the piano, we have, according to the key signature, E flat, we have A natural, and we have C. And those are the notes we have in the voice part. We have E flat and C with just a D in the middle. What do you call that D in the voice part? Yeah, which kind of non-chord tone? Passing tone, that's right. You see the D in the voice part of measure 47? I just call that a passing tone. Yeah, just your regular run-of-the-mill passing tone. But anyway, these are the notes we have for the chord. Now, by this point, I hope you're in the key of C minor. C minor. E flat fits in C minor. A natural, it's the raised, sixth scale degree in C minor, it's law. So I could maybe give it and make an excuse for that being there. But I certainly can't understand why F sharp is in here. So that's a clear chromatic pitch. And that means that the chord I analyze here has to be one of our two chromatic chords. It's either a secondary dominant or a secondary leading tone. In other words, it's either a 5/7 of something or a 7/7 of something. Well, what kind is it based on the type or quality of this chord? F sharp A C E flat is diminished. It's diminished. And it looks like it's in root position. So it's going to be one of those. So diminished 7 of something. And again, go to the root. If we're saying this is a secondary leading tone chord, F sharp is the leading tone to what note? Just go up a half step. G. And G would be the bass note of what Roman? Wow, yeah. Okay. Yes?
Yeah, maybe a silly question, but does it matter if you're at 5 or 5/7, when you do that?
Over here?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's not a silly question. I may have mentioned it, but it probably was early on and it was in passing. The chord that sits to the right of the slash, even if you go to a 5/7, just make this a triad. Yeah, just call it a triad. So you don't need to put any sevens on this. And also, if let's say you go to a chord in first inversion, which I'm not saying you do, but you don't need to put the inversion here either. It's always just a root position triad to the right of the slash, regardless of whether you go to an inverted chord or a seventh chord or what have you. Just do the simplest root position triad. Yes?
So maybe you could do the measure after that.
Yeah. So, well, let's go to this. We have G in the left hand of the piano in the next bar. And up above, looks like we have B natural. And then we have a G way up high. And then we have D and we have F. And then there's a C and E flat in the middle, but those are just passing tones. Okay? So again, in C minor, well, how would you analyze G, B, D, F? That's right. That's right. That's how I would analyze that.
I think I looked at the B natural and I thought it was a.
Oh, the B natural threw you off?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, why does the accidental, the natural have to be there? Is that really a chromatic pitch though in C minor? No, we gotta have the natural though to raise T in the minor key. But yeah, B natural definitely belongs in C minor. So it's not meant to throw you off, it just has to be there to make it a dominant, a major minor seven.
So would it be wrong, so for that one, I didn't put the C, E and the passing tones, I like made a different chord and then made it go back to the 5? Would that be wrong to write that?
I guess not, although I think I would just prefer if you just have one chord for that entire measure. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I think that's what I have, and I'm not saying you're wrong necessarily, but I think that's a simpler way to view that measure.
Okay.
Because really what's happening there is Mozart is reaching a half cadence in C minor. He's landing on this G chord, which is a 5 chord. Half cadence in C minor. Did you, at the 2 pivot chord spots, did you show or indicate the new key? Okay, because you can definitely get points for that, and if you don't indicate the new key there, then you definitely lose points for that. All right, we're about a quarter of the way, well, a little more than a quarter of the way through the class. I would like to collect this, if you can tear it out of your workbook and make sure your name is on it. As I said, I'll grade the analysis, the Roman numeral part. On the last day of Theory 4, you all want to take your workbooks in school. Looks pretty good to me. Although, I would just make the 6 since you're in minor, I would make it count. Sir? That's your work. Okay. I didn't know something fell off my stand or not. All right, so today I'm kind of excited because we're going to learn another way that composers will modulate between 2 keys. And this type of modulation is called chromatic modulation. You may notice that when you get into Theory 3 and Theory 4, almost everything becomes chromatic. We deal with lots of accidentals, because Theory 1 and 2 is largely just diatonic. You've got to get used to the basics there. But now we're moving into music that uses a lot of accidentals. And chromaticism is one way that composers can actually change or move from one key to another, which I'll try to explain to you as best I can. It goes without saying that common chord modulation or pivot chord modulation is the most frequently encountered type of modulation. And that's why we learned that kind first. It's by far the most frequently encountered, just your standard common or pivot chord modulation. But there are obviously other ways to modulate. In fact, there are many other ways to modulate. And really in this class, I can only teach you one other. There's only time to teach you one other way to modulate, even though there are further methods and ways to do that, but that's beyond the scope of this class, and it's beyond the scope of just the 4 semesters of theory that we learn here. Okay, now, one of these, a different way to modulate is through chromatic movement of one of the voices of a passage. And that's known as chromatic modulation. So, let me put the term up here. Oops. So we're just going to basically say that it's, the way it comes about is through chromatic movement in, let's see here, one of the voices of a passage. Just one of the voices, not multiple voices. Now, chromatic movement here. Let me explain a little bit about the first 2 words. Chromatic movement in this sense means the chromatic inflection of a note with the same pitch letter name. So for instance, I mean, oftentimes we talk about C going to D flat, and that's just a half step. And so we can say that that's chromatic movement or chromatic motion. But specifically in this case, chromatic movement, we're going by a half step, but we're retaining the same pitch letter name, and we're just changing the pitch by a half step. Okay? So C to C sharp would be an example of chromatic movement. And G to G sharp would be an example of chromatic movement. And F sharp going the other way to F natural would be an example of chromatic movement. It's where you move by a half step, but the pitch letter names are the same. Okay? That's typically how this modulation comes about, is that you'll see one pitch letter name, and then the very next pitch letter name, you'll see the same, well, you'll see the same pitch letter name, but it'll be a half step different, is what I guess I'm trying to say. Okay? So the chromatic inflection of a note with the same pitch letter name. That's basically how this type of modulation happens. Chromatic modulation often occurs when there is no pivot chord present in the music, or when there's only a weak or a poor pivot chord in the music to help usher in the new key. So again, this is a way that composers can modulate, and it's a method we can analyze a type of modulation when we don't have a pivot chord in the music, or we don't have a good one. We just have a real lousy weak pivot chord. And there are cases where this happens. So for instance, I've got a short progression here that I started analyzing with Roman numerals, but there's a brief modulation and it goes to D at the end, and I'm going to use this as an example to show you how common chord modulation, that type of analysis, doesn't really work in this example. So let's see, I'm going to take this to the piano so I can play it. Okay, so we're in G major, and the progression that you see on the board sounds approximately like this. Now I could put more chords following this in G major to really emphasize or really establish D major. But that's not really the point. This is just this much to show you how the modulation happens. Okay? Now, if I'm going from G major to D major, let's think about the signal pitches, like we used to do, okay, with common chord modulation. Finding signals is still very important, still doable, and you should still do that when you do any kind of modulation. If I'm going from G major to D major, there is only one signal pitch that will help me get from here to here. What is that one signal pitch? C sharp, right? The difference between the two these key signatures. These are both major keys, so I don't have to worry about the presence of T or the absence or the lowering of T. I don't have to worry about any of that. Okay? As you go look through this passage that I just played, where's the first C sharp that you find? Right here, right in the bass. Okay. So we'd say that this is the signal chord. And it is the signal chord. Same as the other type of modulation, same procedure. That's the signal chord, because it contains the signal, C sharp that we identified. But if we were to back up one chord from the signal chord like we normally do in pivot chord modulation, we find an A minor triad. Now, does an A minor triad work nicely in both the old key of G and the new key of D? In other words, could I try to do some kind of force thing here and say, well, I guess an A minor triad in the new key, that's like a minor 5. Makes me want to puke. No, so there, in other words, you know, we find our signal chord. We typically back up one chord before for the pivot, but we find out, well, there really isn't a pivot chord here. And if you try to force it, it's at best, it's a very lousy, poor reed pivot chord. Okay? So when we're analyzing a modulation, and we look for the pivot chord in its normal location and we don't find one, do we just throw our pencils down and say, that's it, I'm done? I give up. I mean, this is ridiculous. What does he expect us to do? No, obviously we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to think of, well, there's a chance that it could be a different type of modulation. And it is going to be. This is an example of chromatic modulation. Okay? In this case, since there's no pivot chord, the modulation to D is brought about through chromatic motion in one of the voices. In this case, it's happening in the bass voice. You see this? C, C sharp, and D. Remember how I said chromatic movement? You got one pitch, then the same pitch letter means it's a half step different. Well, this is a perfect case of that right here. C natural, C sharp, and D. So what we could say is that the signal pitch, see the C sharp was the signal pitch? We say that the signal pitch is approached by a half step and it's left by a half step. That's typically what occurs in a chromatic modulation. Now, the way to analyze a chromatic modulation is to circle the signal pitch and the two notes that are a half step away on both sides of it. So, I guess I can do that in a different color. I don't care if you circle the signal pitch and the ones on both sides of it as one big circle or 3 separate circles. But either way, you've got to circle them. Because these three, this chromatic motion and this voice, this is what is bringing about modulation in this case. There's no pivot chord to smooth the change of key out. Okay? There's no pivot chord to smooth it out. So you want to circle the signal pitch and the two notes that are a half step away on both sides of the signal pitch, circle those in the music. Now, in a chromatic modulation, this is typically how it works. The first of the 3 circle pitches always belongs to the old key. C natural belongs to G major. It's part of a chord that still belongs to G major. Okay? The signal pitch itself and the next pitch, the last 2 pitches that are circled, they belong to the new key. And they will be part of chords that belong to the new key, that you will analyze in the new key. So typically what we have is, well, let me continue how we analyze this modulation. So there's no pivot chord, right? So what we can do is we can just draw a line. And from this point forward, where we have the signal pitch and the signal chord, we'll just start analyzing in the new key. So for instance, how would I analyze this A7 chord in first inversion? 5, 6, 5, and then this would be analyzed as a.
So I noticed like for this one, it follows like a chord progression. Will it always do that when it modulates?
When you say it follows a chord progression, like how do you?
Well, it's like 5 to 1, like finishes like 3 to 1.
You know, 5 to 1 is very common. I don't know that it has to be 5 to 1, but that is very common, you're right. There are some more things I still want to say about this, but just to reiterate, when you analyze a modulation, I would always check first to see if the modulation type is pivot chord, a common chord, since that is still by far the most common way to modulate. But, like we did here, once you find the signal chord, and you back up one, and if you don't have a pivot chord there, or you have a lousy pivot chord there, then start thinking about this idea that it could be this type, and look for chromatic motion in one of the voices. If you find chromatic motion in one of the voices like we did here, C, C sharp, D, then circle those 3 pitches. That's part of analyzing the modulation. Draw a line between the first and the second, because that's where the keys change. The first pitch, the circle, belongs to the old key. The last 2 circled pitches belong to chords in the new key. And just start analyzing in the new key from that point. Okay. The signal pitch in the center of the circle is almost always the leading tone, or T, of the new key in a chromatic modulation. Not always, but almost always. The signal pitch, the center one that you end up circling, is almost always T, or the leading tone of the new key. Now, even though there is no overlap or dovetailing of the 2 keys, like there is here, like there is in a chromatic modulation, because we don't have a pivot chord, chromatic modulation is not really jarring, because the 3-note chromatic motion kind of gradually eases the listener into the new key. So it's not like, you know, we play one chord in an old key and then all of a sudden, bam, we just shock you into going into another key and force your ear to adjust. It's not really that way. But even though there's no pivot chord, it's not jarring or, you know, really shocking, because this kind of motion here just gradually eases the listener's ear into the new key. It's just a half-step motion. Half-step motion. Let me play that passage again. You can hear how we get from G major to D major. I didn't really feel yanked out of one key and forced into another one, not really. Now, be aware that in a chromatic modulation, the 3-note chromaticism can occur in any voice of the texture. It can occur in the soprano, the alto, the tenor, or the bass. It does not have to occur in the bass. So as I said before, when you're analyzing a passage that you know that modulates, check first to see if the modulation is of the old kind, the pivot chord type. If it's not pivot chord type, look for a 3-note chromatic line in one of the voices. Let me just, since it's up here, let me just ask you this. I see also another 3-note chromatic motion in the tenor voice. I see it here. You see G, G sharp, and A. Why did I not focus or circle those pitches when I was going from G major to D major? Why did I not circle these and say, yep, look, that's a chromatic modulation?
Because the external is part of the secondary part?
Yeah, and does G sharp really belong and fit in D major? Does it lead us there? No, it really has nothing to do with it. So this is what's called sometimes a red herring. It's like something that looks like it's tempting, but it's not really. It's just false. It's garbage. And it's not really what you need to be following. This, however, is what we need because C sharp makes total sense to get us into D major. Okay? Now, I don't know how many of you still have, you remember this sheet I gave you with these examples on at the end of the common chord modulation, the end of last unit? I don't know, do you still have that? I guess if not, I can display some of that up here on the screen. But I want to give us a little bit of analysis practice with this chromatic modulation by using some of these Greek examples. And if you still have this sheet, you'll know that we didn't go through every one of these examples because some of these examples are actually chromatic modulation examples, not common chord modulation examples. For example, if you do have the sheet, if you want to look at number 1, which I have up on the screen here. You know, and if you don't have a handout, that's fine. Like you have to have it. What I'd like to do is go to the piano and I'd like to play this short example. And then I'd like to find out what type of modulation is used here. What's the first key? D major, I would agree. What's the last key?
A major.
A major, I would agree also. Are those two keys closely related? Yes, they are. They differ by just one accidental. Okay. Now, if you didn't know what type of modulation the composer used to get from D to A, we have to go through our regular process still. What is the only signal between those two keys? G sharp, right? The difference between the key signatures. Where's the first place you see a G sharp? Yeah, beat 3 in the first full measure. It's right here, you see it in the bass. Okay. All right, so that is, you've got to decide that you've got to conclude that is the signal chord, because it contains the signal. That is the first chord in the new key of A. Now here, what I would do is I would go back a chord and see if this is pivot chord modulation first. Let's go back a chord. You see that GBD chord right there on beat 2? Well, that functions really nicely in D as a 4. But does GBD function in the key of A? No. No, it doesn't. It doesn't, you can't give it a Roman numeral in the key of A. It doesn't work. So, I checked to see if this chord is a pivot chord, and really it's not. This doesn't make a good pivot chord, that GBD chord. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well that's all right. I'm not going to panic, I have an alternative. Maybe it's chromatic modulation. Can you see any chromatic movement, 3-note chromaticism in one of the voices surrounding that signal? Yeah, I'm looking at it upside down. You see G, G sharp, and A in the bass. So, again, if you have this sheet, and if you don't, that's okay, but if you have it, what I would do is I would circle those 3 pitches. You can circle them individually like this, or you can circle them all together in one big circle. I don't care how you do it. This is what's making the modulation happen. Now, where does the old key end and the new key begin in our analysis? The old key is going to end with this chord here. The new key is going to start with this chord here. So what I can do is I can just draw a line, and I'm going to analyze the first chord in the old key, and the old key is D, by the way, and that's going to be a 4, right? And then I just start analyzing in the new key from that point on, but make sure to show the new key. I don't care if you do it in front or on the other side of the line that you drew. There's the new key. And I can analyze this one as a 5, 6. And I can analyze this one as a 1. And I can analyze the next measure all in A. That's fine and dandy. But do you see how I still found the signal, as I always do for any modulation? I found the signal chord. I checked first, backing up one chord, to see if it's pivot chord modulation. It's not, because there is no good pivot chord there in that location. So then I decide, okay, well then it's got to be chromatic modulation. So then I look for 3-note chromatic motion around the signal pitch. And lo and behold, sure enough, there it was. I found it in the bass. Yeah, let me play this passage again so you can hear it. Starting in D major. Take a look at number 2 over here. I'm going to play this, and I want you to tell me what the 2 keys involved are, and then we're going to find out how it modulates. Which method? So we start in G for number 2. What's the first key? G major, and the second key is A minor. Are those 2 keys closely related? Yes, they are. They are. Got to go through this process now. Help me find out where the modulation is and what kind. Is it common chord modulation, the pivot chord type, or is it chromatic? Okay, let's think about the 2 keys involved, G major and A minor. I think there's a couple signal pitches we can look for here. What's the difference between the 2 keys' key signatures? Okay, F sharp in this key, but what in this key? F natural. And because this is a minor key, I have to think about what is T of this key. G sharp. So these are the 2 signals that will alert me to the fact that the music is moving from G major to A minor. Any one of these or both of these signals could alert me to that. Well, what do you see first as you go through? I see an F natural before I see a G sharp. Okay? So I'm going to assume, my thinking is that that's the signal there in the bass, and that would be part of the signal chord. And if that assumption is true, let's go back one chord to see if that makes a good pivot. What is this chord? A D major chord? Does that make a good pivot between G major and A minor? No, it doesn't, because in G major it'd be a 5, 6. And in A minor, it doesn't compute. It doesn't work. G major and A minor. Get that garbage out of here. Okay, so I'm not out of luck though, right? Could it be a chromatic modulation? Do you see some 3-note chromatic motion surrounding that signal pitch in the bass? Yeah, I do. I see F sharp, F natural, and then E. See how that's all half-step motion? Okay, so what I do is I circle those pitches. I didn't do a good job, but you get the idea. And this is where the two keys diverge. The first of the circle pitches belongs to a chord in the old key. So the old key is G. What is the analysis of that chord? 5/6, right? The new key starts with the signal pitch, that chord. We said the new key is A minor. Can I analyze that chord in A minor? I better be able to. What is it? Yeah, 4/6. And then what's the chord right after that? Potential 6/4. And then the last beat of the measure would be 5/7 if you want. And then if you want. So here, let me get this a little clearer here. 4/6, and then we'll do this 5/7, and we'll do 1. But again, this 3-note chromatic motion, it just happens to be in the bass. Really, the truth is, this chromatic motion does not have to be in the bass. A lot of times it is, as we've seen, but it doesn't have to be in that voice. Okay, let's hear that example again. Now that we see how it modulates. Starting in G. One more. Let's look at number 6. Oof. Looks like a long one, huh? Listen to it quickly and then see if you can tell me what the two keys that are involved are. Yeah, say that again. Not B flat, but E flat. Yeah, E flat major. I know it starts with a B flat chord, but that's just a 5. The key signature is E flat major. What is the last key? Look at the cadence there. F minor. F minor. E flat major to F minor. Yeah, those are closely related keys. All right, let's find the signal pitches again. Let's do it with this. Okay, the difference between the two key signatures, F minor has something that E flat does not. Right? F minor has a D flat in its key signature and E flat major does not. And then what is F minor's leading tone? E natural. Okay, let's look for one of those. Yeah, I see something. What do you see? E natural, that's right. I see E natural right there. So I'm going to say that's the signal chord. It's the first chord in the new key. I don't know what to do with my pencil, but let's back up a chord to see if the prior chord works as a good pivot. Looks like it's an E flat major triad. Well, if I try to make this a pivot chord, I call it a 1 in the old key. and I call it a capital 7 in the new key. Pivot chords with 5s or 7s are pretty poor. I don't really like that analysis. It makes me think I'm trying to force it into a pivot chord modulation when there's really a better analysis. Let's look for chromatic modulation. Do you see 3-note chromatic motion around that signal pitch? You bet. E flat, E natural, F. Circle the pitches. The first of the circled notes belongs to a chord in the old key, which is going to be 1. The last 2 circled pitches belong to chords in the new key, which is F minor. What is this chord right here, F minor? Yep, looks like a 5-6-5. And then the next chord has a 9-chord tonian right here. But this is actually a 1. What type of suspension is that G in the alto? I just put parentheses. That's right, it's a 9/8 suspension. You got it. Oops, now you can't see the analysis. Anyways, that's the idea. So, are there any questions about how to identify a chromatic modulation and how to analyze a chromatic modulation? Now, the assignment for next class is not the easiest one in the world. You're going to need to analyze a short piece on page 178 in your workbook. And it's not so straightforward and cut and dry. There's a few more non-chord tones and there's actual real music passage and these that are made up. So there are multiple modulations in this short passage too. You got to decide whether they're pivot chord or chromatic. And then in addition to that, then I've got a half-sheet handout that I'd like you to do part writing for, kind of like I got here with the chromatic modulation. So it's this half sheet plus the analysis in the workbook for Wednesday.